Swifters, it's Prof G, and prepare to bind up those variables because we're going to talk about two-way bindings in SwiftUI. We'll implement this with a $sign in front of our state variables, and we'll take this concept for a spin by trying out a bunch of controls that require two-way bindings, including the TextField, toggle, ColorPicker, DatePicker, and Stepper. Let's belly up to that big learning binding buffet.
If you're new here, welcome. You might want to check out the course playlist to see how we got here.
So we're going to start by building a new project to try out these new techniques, and then we can incorporate what we've learned into our You Are Awesome app. And before we try out the new techniques, let's use a couple of views and techniques we've already seen so that we have something to compare the new concepts against. And since we're going to be starting with concepts you've already worked with, take it as a challenge to perform the setup. So what I'd like you to do is to create a new project named Two-Way Bindings, build an app that works like the one at the right. When you click a button, it updates the text view above it with the number of times the button's been clicked. Keep track of the number of presses in a variable called press count. A text view should show the press count as press count : and whatever the press count is. A button below that text view that shows the press count should be labeled press me, and it should increment the press count and update the text view each time it's pressed. And try your best to copy the button style and fonts you see at the app on the right. So pause. You should be able to solve this, Swifter. Hopefully these challenges are helping reinforce what you've learned. And when you're ready, resume, and let's compare answers. So I'll open Xcode, create a new Xcode project. An iOS app should be selected already, so just click Next. I'm going to call this Two-Way Bindings, upper camel case, no spaces, create, full size of screen, restart preview, hide navigator pane. Give us a little more room, and we're ready to cook. Now I'll keep the VStack that Xcode gave me and the text view, but I'm going to delete the image view, and I'll change the text view string to press count : string interp, and I need a variable to hold the current press count that I can put inside the string interp. So up top here, inside the struct declaration line, I am going to add a state variable with @state private var press count, lower camel case, equals 0. Since our press count starts at 0, then I'll put press count between the string interp, and below the text view, I'll add a button view. We're already inside of VStack, so this is okay.
Select the option with title key and action.
My title will be the string press me. I'll tab over to the action parameter and press return to change to the trailing closure format that I like so much. And my action is simply press count plus equals 1. Then below the button, I'm going to add a button style modifier with .button style, and I'm going to pass in the .border prominence style. And to change the font, I'm going to add a font modifier to the VStack that'll change the font of everything in the VStack.
Before I do this, I'll delete the dot padding just to illustrate a point. We'll add that back later. And we'll add .font, .title 2.
Looking good. And then let's try this out. And nice. With each press, we're increasing the press count by 1. Excellent. And if you didn't get this, Swifter, keep on practicing. You'll get there. Coding is just like learning a foreign language. You got to practice to get it down, but you'll get better and better with each attempt. So here's a reminder of why we use the state variable. Variables that are part of structs are destroyed and their values are lost when the views are redrawn. But you can think of these state variables, the variables that have @state in front of their definitions, as variables that are tucked away in their special storage location. So these values remain even as the rest of the view is destroyed and recreated. So in this example here we've got our state variable, it's got a 2 in it, and if we click on the button action closure executes and updates the press count by 1. So press count is now tucked away in its little state location, and it went from 2 to 3. Now, since press count has just changed, and press count is used to display the string inside a text view, then the old view is thrown away, including any values that were in the view. But since press count is in the state variable tucked away in the side, it's not thrown away, so that when the view is recreated, we get the 3 from press count, and it's shown in the text view. Now, another thing you'll hear and you'll read in tutorials is that you can't even use variables in a struct because structs are immutable. They can't change just like constants. Now, this is sometimes poorly worded, and it's tough even for existing Swift programmers to understand, but here's a demo if you've heard this and it confuses you. And we haven't really talked about creating your own struct, so if this slide is confusing for you, you can ignore it since we haven't really talked about defining our own structs yet. But essentially, while it's fine to create a struct, then use that struct to define a variable, then write code to change the properties of that variable, structs cannot have code that changes their own properties unless we do some additional steps with that code. So see this example down here? This is not allowed. The func change name is a method. It's a function inside the struct person. And Swift won't allow a method of a struct to directly change its own property in the way that we've written it here. So this line here where the method is trying to change the property named first, that's not allowed. That's why Swift is complaining that the property of the function, that's the self part here, is immutable and this can't be done. So @state is what SwiftUI calls a property wrapper, But when we want to get at the value inside, we just refer to the variable itself to read or write that variable. Now notice I said read or write. We can see we either read or write in the code that you just wrote. So when our button action says press plus equals 1, we're writing a value to press count inside the button action. And when we refer to press count inside the text view, we're reading press count's value. Now some SwiftUI views, which we haven't seen yet, will both read from a variable to update how the view should look and write to a variable if the interaction with the view changes the value. They read and write in the same line. So these views are typically controls that both read and write a given variable, and they need to use what SwiftUI calls a two-way binding to perform that read and write. All you need to do for the two-way binding is to put a $ in front of the variable name. Now new programmers or programmers that are new to SwiftUI often forget to put the $ where it's needed. After all, this is a new concept, it's unfamiliar to folks, but one of the nice things about Xcode is that it'll both let you know where it's needed in code completion by indicating that you have a binding variable as one of the parameters, and it'll let you know if you forget the $, and even better, it'll offer to fix it for you if needed. Now here are just a few examples of some of those views that both read and write a state variable when they're used, and so they need a $ when using the variable. And notice all of these are controls. They're things that are manipulated by the user. So now let's try out some of these views, these controls that require two-way bindings. So we'll be able to learn some new views that are controls, and we'll be able to try out the two-way bindings with the $ in front of the variable name. So let's first add a toggle view, and you've seen this in our You Are Awesome app. So toggles are for switching things on, off, or true or false. They look like little switches. So below our button code, but before the closing curly in VStack, I'll start to type toggle. Now code completion gives me a few options, but select this one that has the parameters title key and is on. Now notice that title is a string, but is on is a binding that's a Boolean value. Now binding means we need to add a $ in front of it. So press return to enter this code. For now, I'll just enter the title as the string in double quotes toggle : and the binding value needs a bool. So we need to create an @state variable that's a bool that will hold the state of the toggle. So up here where we define our variables, we'll write @state private var, and we'll name this toggle is on, lower camel case, and we'll initialize it to true by saying equals true. Now remember, when used in toggle, I need to add the $ in front of this variable for the two-way read-write binding that code completion told me about. Now just to show you what happens if I forget this and I put toggle is on in here without the $, Xcode says, cannot convert value toggle is on of type bool to expected binding bool, use wrapper instead. And the fix will insert a $ in front, so I'll click fix. Xcode inserts the $ in front of this variable, so if you forget to do this, Xcode will always remind you and offer a fix. Now the toggle view shows up in the VStack, but it's touching the edges of the device, so I'm going to add padding below the VStack so the VStack is padded and everything inside it will have some padding between it and the sides of the device. And by the way, notice our toggle is on. That's because the bool that defines it was set to true. If we change this so that the bool is initialized to false, see how the toggle turns gray? That indicates the toggle is off. So that's how the toggle view is both reading the toggle is on value, but when we click it, see how things change? We're also writing to that very same value which we interact with in the toggle. That's why we need the $ for the two-way binding. Cool. So I'm going to set the initialization back to true, so it's on by default. And I want you to also see that you can use toggle is on in other parts of your code, but you likely won't need the $ in front of it for two-way binding. For example, we can refer to the toggle is on variable to update the text that displays to the left of the switch, like this. So instead of saying toggle : in this string, I'm going to say toggle is, and then string interp : and in the string interp, let's add a ternary operator. For the first part of the ternary operator, I can say toggle is on. We don't need to say equals true, and that's because toggle is on is a Boolean value, so it's already either true or false. Remember, the first part of the ternary operator needs a condition that's going to be either true or false. Then space question mark space. After the question mark, if the condition is true, what do we want to do? Well, in double quotes, I'm just going to pass back the string on, then space : space. That's what happens if it's false. And in between double quotes here, I'm going to pass back the string off. Now see how the text for the toggle is updated? On if it's true, click the toggle, off if it's off. Switches back and forth, nice. And since the string in toggle view was only reading here, strings don't update, then we didn't need to put a $ in front of toggle is on in the string part. Cool, that's the toggle view and the use of the binding bool value that it needs. So before we enter the next control, let's space out the different views. I'm going to add a spacer at the bottom and the top of the V stack. I'm going to add 2 spacers in between the button and the toggle, and in between the 2 spacers is where I'll enter my text field. Now a text field lets a user input a string into the app, very useful. So to get the text field, just type text field.
Don't confuse it with the text view. Text view is just for display purposes. Text field allows data entry.
I'm going to select the option with title and text. Notice in code completion the title is a string. This is going to be the grayed out placeholder text that's inside of the field. You usually use that to indicate what the user should enter, like a name, first name, last name, phone number. And then the text, the second parameter, is the binding string that holds the value that the user will enter. So the user is going to enter the value, that's the input. It's also going to be displayed in this field, so that's the output. Since we've got input and output both, this is going to need a binding variable. So press return to accept this option. For the title, I'm going to enter the string as enter a name, and then I'll tab over to the text parameter. Notice this needs to be a binding string. So up top, let's create a new state variable named name, and we'll initialize this to the empty string. And remember, if we add a variable in an area that needs a binding and we forget to put a $sign in front, Xcode's going to warn us and offer to fix it. So make sure you've got a $sign in front of that name variable in the text parameter of your text field. Notice when there's nothing in the field, you get the grayed out text for whatever title you put in. That's why it says enter a name in here. That's what we put in for our title field. And now if I enter my name in here,
and let me point out a recurring Xcode preview bug. Now this has been around for more than a year. Hopefully it's fixed by the time you see this, but just in case, sometimes, and it's not clear when you try to enter data in a text field in a previewing app in Xcode, the text field doesn't accept keystrokes. Anything you type in remains in the code editor. You'll end up typing characters you don't want in your code. You'll end up with errors in your code. It's terrible. This happens even if you've clearly clicked on the preview's text field. Now, if this ever happens to you, one easy fix is to just go to the project navigator, click any other file, then click back on the file with the text field, and the text field should now work. Also, Xcode doesn't keep the precise preview settings when you click off a file and get back to it. I look forward to Apple fixing that sometime too, but for now, you'll likely have to adjust your preview again. But now that things are working and I can enter a name in the text field,
I can see the name in the text field, but you can also access the data in the name variable that the user just entered and use that in other parts of your app. So let's do that by adding a text view below the text field. Remember, text views, we've used these. These are just text that display any strings that are inside of them, while text fields that we just entered allow the user to enter input as strings. And so we enter the text view, open parenthesis, and the string that we're going to put inside of this is going to be in double quotes, name entered, string interp, and the string interp should just be the variable name. So if Beyonce uses our app, her name shows up in the text view. Nice! Another view control for your SwiftUI repertoire. By the way, like many views, the text field also has different styles that you can choose from. The text field style that we're using is a default or plain style, but if you wanted one that had a rounded border around the text field, so it's a little easier to see the input area, you could enter a modifier below text field, not the text view, that's just dot text field style. What are the styles? Let's see, with dot notation between the parens. Plain is the one that showed up automatically. Why don't we select this one for dot rounded border? And we can see the text field is a bit more visible because it's got a nice faint rounded corner border around the entry area. Nice. Now let's add a color picker, a very cool control that allows your app to let the user make a color choice. And this can be nice if you ever want to let the user customize the color of, say, their background or an avatar. So below the toggle, I'll add another spacer, then enter color picker, and I'm going to select the option that's title and selection. And code completion says this creates a color picker with a text label generated from a title string. Well, we're going to give the title a string, and the selection needs a binding color. So let's press return to select this, and for the string, the title will be just pick a color, and for selection, well, we need to create a variable to hold our color. So up top where our variables are, I'll enter @state private var selected color, and then I'll explicitly declare this as a color with color capital C after the variable name. So that says that selected color is going to be a color variable. Color is a dedicated iOS variable type. And then when I say equal, I can press dot, and code completion presents me with options for colors. Since I've explicitly declared this as a color, I'm going to initialize this to the color red. Now I'll add a $selected color to the selection parameter in my color picker, and now I see my color picker label and the color picker circle below. And the red color is in the center of the little round color picker because we initialize the selected color to red. Now, if you click the red, you'll pull up the color picker. I don't really like the user interface here because you have to select a color and then click the X button, which usually means cancel. I wish there were an OK and cancel, but after you select a color, click X, and we see the new color is now in the center of the color picker circle, so this works fine. But since we've selected a color, let's do something with it. So why don't we add a rectangle above this and then change its color to whatever color the user selected. So first I'll change the title in my color picker to read, pick a rectangle color, and then above this I'm going to add rectangle, capital R, with open and close parens. Then underneath this I'm going to add the modifier .fill, and I'm going to pass in the color selected color. No $sign here because it's only reading this value. And then I'm going to shrink down the rectangle with a .frame modifier.
Remember, entering WIHE will select those two optional parameters too. When you press return, you get width and height.
In between parentheses, I'm going to pass in width :100, height :100. And this looks great. So why don't we select a different color, and the rectangle color changes. Nice work. Now the next control I'll show you that requires a two-way binding is the DatePicker. This is another cool control that will allow the user to select either a date or time or both, and there are a lot of customization options here. We'll eventually learn more about working with dates in future apps, but for now we'll just select a date and time. So below my color picker, I'm going to add another spacer, and then I'm going to add DatePicker, capital D, capital P, and select the option with title and selection.
So the title key takes a string, that's going to be the label for the DatePicker, and the selection says binding date with a capital D. Now, date with a capital D is a special Swift data type, just like string or int, but what a date holds is a combined date and time.
So press return to select this option, and for the title we'll just put in the string date : and for the selection we need to create a date variable. So let's scroll up to the top, and then underneath the existing state variables we'll say @state private var selected date, lower camel case, equals capital D date. Again, that's an Apple data type. But when we follow this with an open and close parenthesis, that creates a date with the current date and time that it registers off of the device when this line of code runs in your app. Now let's scroll down to DatePicker, and for our selection variable, remember this is a binding variable, so we'll say $selected date. And then below this, I want to enter a text view to hold the date. So I'm going to say text, then in parentheses, I'm going to pass in the string selected date is : string interp. And in the string interp, I'm just going to put in selected date, no $sign here. The text view is not a two-way binding. And look at that. My date picker with the date and time shows up. I can click on the date. It pulls up this cool calendar style date picker. I can scroll through the months, pick a date. And if I click on the time, I also get the option to select time, AM and PM. And this is looking great. And the text view down below shows about as complete a date and time as I'd want. Now, there are a lot of options to customize the format of the date and time, and you can even eliminate either the date or the time if you want to. Again, we're going to cover those in future lessons for apps that use dates and times, but just to give you a taste, right after the selected date variable that's inside of the string interp in my text view, I'm going to enter .formatted.
You get a couple options in here. Select the one with the date and time parameters. Code completion says this generates a locale-aware string representation of a date. So by locale-aware, it pays attention to your time zone and will convert that universal time into the date and time appropriate for your time zone. And then it says it does this using the specified date and time format styles. So we want this, press return. Now when I press return, I see the date wants a date format style, date style. If we use dot notation, we see a bunch of different options in here. Select dot abbreviated, then tab to time. We'll use dot notation here, and the one I want to select is dot shortened.
And we see the abbreviated and shortened date and time in the text view string. That's looking good.
So why don't you put a notch in your SwiftUI utility belt that you now know how to work with date pickers and dates. And up next, let's work with the stepper control.
In its most basic form, it offers two buttons, a minus button and a plus button. And when you press either of these buttons, you move a stepper value up or down. So below the text under DatePicker, I'm going to add a new spacer, and then I'll enter stepper, and stepper is a very customizable control. We're going to use one of the most basic options. We'll assume you want to move your stepper value up or down one at a time within a range of 1 through 10. So to get this to happen, let's highlight the option that has title, value, and in. That's this one here with those values highlighted. We'll ignore the stuff that's dimmed out.
Now, code completion says this creates a stepper instance that will increment and decrement a binding value by a step sized within a closed range that you provide. So we know it accepts a title key in here. That's going to be its title. The value holds the result of stepping up or down. And in wants a closed range. We know what that is. Remember, we learned about that when we work with for loops. It's got a number, ... a number. So that's a range of values we can work with. Now, even though it mentions step in here, that's grayed out. We're not going to work with a step. If you wanted to go up by 2s or some other value that was different than 1, you could add a step value. We don't need it. We're just going to press return and enter the values that are highlighted.
And for the first value, I can put a string in here to use as my stepper label. So I'm going to enter the string stepper value : string interp, and we'll fill in the string interp in just a bit. Then I'm going to jump over to the option that says closed range. So that's at the end. And this is where I can specify a range of values that I want to step through. So if I want to step through the values from 1 through 10, I'll just enter 1 ... 10. Now this range is a set of integers, so I need to create a value variable to hold the stepper's value. So we can head up to our variables, and I'm going to enter @state private var stepper value lowercase equals 1. And since my stepper range is 1 through 10, initializing it to 1 is fine. We'll start at the very low end of the range. And then I'll scroll down and I'll enter my new variable as a two-way binding in the value parameter, $stepper value. And in the string interp I entered earlier, I'm just going to enter stepper value, no $, since all I do here is read the value to show it in the string. And then the stepper shows up at the bottom of my preview. Nice. And if you press the plus button, you'll see each time you do that, the stepper value changes by 1. Now notice you can also press the minus button, but you can't go past the low end of the closed range. You can't go past 1 since our closed range is 1 to 10. And similarly, if you press the plus button, you can't press it so many times that you go past 10. You stop at 10. So Swifter, nice work. You're stepping lively with the stepper view. Now you know about two-way bindings, adding the $ before, and you learned a bunch of cool controls that require the use of the $ two-way binding variable.
I hope you enjoy this big learning binding buffet.
Now be sure to let me know if you're enjoying these lessons. It is a lonely business creating content in YouTube, so I love hearing from you. And as always, keep hacking.